Design is a way of thinking to solve a certain problem. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that when I'm going to go into the design field, I'm a person who's going to solve problems visually. I think art can exist by itself. Art doesn't have a function to serve, but design does. The book definition still stands, which is that it's a visual art form to communicate messages visually in an intentional way. However, at the end of it, we are using graphic design to either communicate a message or bring attention to a topic or solve a certain problem. Design is a way of thinking to solve a certain problem. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that when I'm going to go into the design field, I'm a person who's going to solve problems visually and create creative visual solutions for people. So I think I want to kind of restart and try again to define design in a broader sense, so that it helps people to know from beforehand what I'm getting into. So to me, if I were to define graphic design, it would be a way we craft and create meaning visually. The difference between a person who's professionally working as a graphic designer and just a normal person who's looking at things visually is that we designers know how structure works and how we can create a structure where meaning can be placed. One of the first things I wanted to start with was to give a difference between art and design, and I think that's one of the big questions that come to me all the time. I think art can exist by itself. Art doesn't have a function to serve, but design does, because the book definition still stands, which is that it's a visual art form to communicate messages visually in an intentional way. However, at the end of it, we are using graphic design to either communicate a message or bring attention to a topic or solve a certain problem. Design is a way of thinking to solve a certain problem. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that when I'm going to go into the design field, I'm a person who's going to solve problems visually and create creative visual solutions for people. So a client will come and tell you, I'm an owner of an Asian restaurant and I need you to make a menu for me, and I sell sushis. So the menu has to solve that problem that they have, that I need a visual representation of what I need for my restaurant. The two main things that I feel any graphic designer or any designer who's doing visual arts should have is elements that we use to create these designs, and also principles. And I'll get a little bit more deeper into those. A line is the space between 2 points. A line can look very simple, but it can be used in multivarious ways. I've used line here to emphasize the headline, right? I can use line to create alignment. I can use line to make a distinction between one part and another. So a line is a tool for a designer to use it to create the meaning they want to create. Of course, there's different types of lines. Dashed lines, there's squiggly lines, there's curved lines, and so on, right? But I'm not going to go too detailed into that. But when you put lines together, we have a shape. And there are 3 basic shapes, which is a square, a triangle, and a circle. So we have a line, we have a shape, and of course, you can fill that shape with color. Even color is a study in itself. We may think that color is just to create something beautiful, but color actually can be used to show a mood of a setting. Color can be used to show emphasis at a specific point. We have, of course, typography, so text, which is a study in itself. Text, by the way, in itself is a graphic, because there's so many different kinds of font faces and style. I'm sure you've heard of it. There are 2 basic types of font faces. One is called serif, and there's something called sans serif. But the difference is serif has these anchors at the end. Sans serif has no extra design elements at the end. When you say, for instance, you're creating a brand, that matters. What is your brand trying to convey? Am I a colorful, playful brand? Am I a serious brand that's giving you important solutions and that's all? People can use font in many ways to communicate a mood, communicate a brand, communicate a visual identity. Then we have form. Form is when you take a shape and make it 3-dimensional. Form provides depth in our visuals. Before that, we had only a 2D image, but form allows the viewer to immerse much more deeply into the visual and give us a sense of space in which that visual lives. So now we have form. And then we have, of course, composition. Composition is the way in which we arrange elements in a visual. So we have a space within which we are working, and in that space, where do I put the text, where do I put the cube, and how do I place other visual elements around to tell the message I want to tell. And we have texture. Texture is when one visual element is repeated many times. If you repeat it more than a certain amount of time, it starts becoming a graphic in itself. But what I'm actually creating is a sense, like why did I choose to do a circle? I could also do a texture that was just made of lines. That would give me a different sense. That would give me a different feeling. So that's why graphic design in its definition is that it's the intentional way of conveying a message. Now we're going to get into what goes into like figuring out where do I put things, where do I start. We have the visual elements. Now how do I put the visual elements together? And that's where the second major part of design comes in. Now we have principles. Principles are the rules that designers use to create. Principles are in itself abstract. Contrast, hierarchy, negative space, these things don't have a physical form and shape. A glass does, a table does. Negative space, there's no physical form and shape. So it's a sense that we develop by practicing these principles. What designers do, and they're very good at that, they understand that they are abstract concepts. They build relationships between these concepts. For instance, this, right? There are two parts. This is a bottle, this is the cap. But the relationship between the bottle and the cap is a sense, but there's a relationship between this and this. It serves a function. So the relationship can't be seen. That's a very core thing, and that's something that comes from practice, right? How to establish those relationships. So we already did contrast in one of the sessions before. We did hierarchy in the next session. What I'm going to attempt to do today is to give you guys a little bit about these three, because that's what we're going to be dealing with today. We're going to deal with contrast, hierarchy, and negative space. And the way this session is structured is that we learn some principles and we apply that immediately by creating a collage. These three are principles that are used to emphasize something in a visual design. So contrast is the way of showing difference between two things to bring attention to a certain topic or a place in the visual. For instance, contrast can be shown in different ways, by the way. Contrast can be shown in the difference between shape. I can also show it by size. And now the moment I've done that, I've created a relationship between these two. It could be the child and a parent. It could be a small house next to a mountain. But already what we are doing, and this is the next layer, designers also tell stories through these relationships. Designers are also storytellers. And this is not only when I'm creating a poster, it's also when I'm creating a web experience. You enter, you go through something, and then you exit. There's always that kind of path, right? And there are many ways of showing that story path in visuals, but we'll not talk about that too much today. That's two ways of showing contrast. You can also show contrast, of course, by color. So by showing two differences, I can emphasize something. So if I have two different colors and then put this in here, where do I really want you to look? The highest contrast, which is this black dot. And I've only used this as a background for where I want you to see. Here's another example of contrast. So this is a prime example of how contrast can be used. They did it through typography, they did it through color, they did it through texture, right? Also, the texture behind is different, here is totally different. Beautiful piece of work, right? Then we have hierarchy. When I'm designing something, I order the elements by its importance. For instance, if I'm making a poster, what are the elements I'm using? I may be having a visual, like an image for the poster. We may have a headline, then we may have a description, and we may have a call to action. For instance, in a website, the call to action is a button where I want the guy to go and click. It could be a contact form. It doesn't matter. It depends on the context. When we put something like this in order, we designers ask ourselves, what's highest priority? Is it this, or is it this, or is it this? So when I want to look at a poster, what do I really want to see? I want to have a visual association of the poster, but I also want all the relevant information. What do I want them to see first? And then I take them to the call to action, which is the QR code. And also, of course, you can add the details. But the way I've aligned this as well, right, is that I could have put the QR code anywhere else. But if you draw an imaginary square like this, you'll see that it's one unit. I did that intentionally so that it goes together. There's intention behind those decisions we make. And the last one is negative space. Negative space is the way we use blank space around the canvas to emphasize something. And I've got some examples. This is a prime example of how negative space can be used. It's how I use that space, right? I can fill it up with everything. It also depends on what I don't say. What I don't say also is something that I'm trying to bring your attention to, right? By not saying something, I'm saying something. So over here, I'm doing a kind of mood. So it's a minimal design by using more white space. I'm understanding a little bit more about, okay, if this was a space I'm walking into, what would it actually be like? And also, it gives me space to receive the information in a very simple and clear way. I'll give you more examples of negative space and how people use it. This is a poster. It's just text and two shapes, but it has said so much. It has told you a story. It has told you that it's about this person. Just asking you guys to think about how space affects the visual elements we put on the thing, you know. And most people, when they look at a canvas, the first thing is, what am I going to put on it? And one of the biggest things, if you're working as a professional designer and someone's feedbacking you, the thing that you're going to get the most is take that out. Remove things you don't need. That's what Steve Jobs was trying to say also in most of his design presentations. Less is more. I've been able to tell you a lot with just very little. Here's another really good example of how negative space can be used. So this is the movie poster of Jaws. The whole thing is dependent on the space between the swimmer and the shark. It gives you that motion, that things are moving, even though it's static. I can create motion by just adding elements in a certain way. And again, this is very simple. You've got the shapes, right? You've got also space, but also I'm getting a sense of motion. Just the way I've arranged the elements. It looks like this is breaking past and going, right? And one may think that, oh, they didn't work so hard for this design. One may say that. A good designer who knows how to construct meaning visually will be able to see the impact that a very simple solution has made, right? You can see it directly.